I'm Liz, and welcome to Believe in Your Shelf. So I'm gonna dive right in to the books we're gonna be talking about today. The first one is called The Borrower by Rebecca Makkai. This book ended up on my list because I read The 100-Year House 2 years ago, which I loved, would highly recommend. And then I wanted to read her new book, which is called The Great Believers, but it was like literally impossible to get at the library. So I ended up looking at this one instead, and it seemed kind of up my alley, and so I picked it up. It is about a children's librarian named Lucy Hull, and she is a very smart, progressive children's librarian. She has kind of a favorite patron who comes to get books from her. His name is Ian Drake, and he's like a really bright, precocious little kid, and she just like loves giving him recommendations. And then she meets his mom, and Mrs. Drake is very like, I don't want Ian reading anything that has witchcraft in it. I don't want Ian reading anything that has magic in it, because they're really religious. And then it sort of comes out that like Ian is literally 10, but he's already in like religious kind of, it's not quite conversion therapy, but it's like he goes to a special group of children who they're trying to, make them straight, which is terrifying because he's 10. And Lucy obviously is horrified by this, and she's kind of trying to figure out if there's any kind of like abuse that she can report. And everyone's kind of telling her to kind of just like forget about it. Like there's nothing you can do. He's probably fine. And then she comes into the library one morning and Ian is there. He's slept there, like he's run away from home. And she's like, okay, get in the car, we're gonna drive you home. So then while they're in the car, Ian is basically like, I'm gonna tell everyone that you kidnapped me unless you take me to my grandmother's house. He clearly just wants to like get away. What ensues is this like messed up road trip between her and Ian. She feels bad and guilty about the fact that she is essentially kidnapping him and like taking him over state lines. She also doesn't want him to go back home because he's clearly like terrified of his parents and his family. They end up kind of like involving Lucy's parents and Lucy's parents' friends. She ends up like kind of carrying this package also for her father, who's Russian and like possibly connected to the mob. I loved this book so much. I already knew that I love Rebecca Makkai, but I like this more than The 100-Year House. I just like love it so much. When you start a book and you can just tell from like page one that it's going to be exactly what you want. That was this book for me. Partly because of what I've already said, like it's about libraries and the role of librarians and being a child and loving books and having them help you through difficult times. And then there's all of these sorts of things about like America, because Lucy's family is Russian, and so she has this kind of like past with her family and like their name getting changed when they came to America. So this kind of identity confusion, and then what America is all about, and then especially like Ian's parents and their religious freedoms and the things that religion is doing to their family. So just like a lot to really dig into, but it's also very funny and it's also very sad, and it just like really affected me. I loved it so much. The writing is really meaty. It just like there's so much that you could just like sink your teeth into, and it's a wacky road trip. What's not to love? There isn't much else to say about it. Like sometimes I feel like I can go on forever about these books that I love, but this one, like I don't really want to spoil it too much because I would highly recommend it to like everyone. Just read it and enjoy it because it's tons of fun and also beautiful and made me cry. I gave this 5 stars. I absolutely just loved everything about it. The next book I'm going to talk about is The Great Alone by Kristen, this heavy brick of a book. This was my book club's book this month, and I know that it is very, very popular. It won the Historical Fiction Goodreads Award this year, so I was really excited to read it. It takes place post-Vietnam, and it is about this girl named Lenny whose parents move her to Alaska at the age of 13. Her father is a war vet, and her parents have this very, very like emotionally charged, intense relationship. And he has like really, really horrifying PTSD. And so he hears from the father of one of the friends he had in Vietnam who died that his friend left him a house in Alaska. So he's like, let's go. We're moving to Alaska. We're going to go like live in the bush. We're going to go live off the land and get away from all this, politics, America, the lower 48, etc. And so they go to Alaska and they find this like incredible community. There's a lot of support for them there, but Lenny's father, Ernst, is still really struggling with all of his stuff from the war. And when he meets the father who contacted him about the property that was left to them, they sort of inform each other as like fear of the government, like fear of the outside world. And that sort of just like moves into a boiling point and things go from there. A lot about this book I really enjoyed. The community that they move into is so interesting and wonderful. I just like love the way that they support each other. It's beautiful. All of the Alaskan homesteading aspects were super interesting, like all of the ways they have to protect themselves from predators and the things they have to do with their food. Like they don't have electricity in their cabin. So all of these things they have to do to protect themselves when the winter comes. So interesting. I'd never really thought about any of that before. So I loved that aspect a lot. The storyline with Ernst and Lenny and Cora, who's her mother, was also really interesting to me, even though it was much more upsetting. Ernst is very abusive and there's like a lot there. Other than that, I really had trouble with this book. I think Kristen Hanna is an interesting kind of writer because she clearly had something in mind for this book and she wanted to write very specific scenes and a very specific story. So anytime she's not writing that, anytime she has to write any kind of like exposition or like, oh, the months are passing, she just seems bored. Like she's writing the book and she seems bored because she's just telling everything. There's no showing. It's all just like, Lenny and Cora did this for the next few months and blah, 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 blah. There are scenes that are so gripping and there are scenes that are just like, it's like Kristen Hanna going, yeah, let's move, let's keep moving until we can get to the next really good scene, which is actually something that I empathize with when I've tried to write. I tend to do the same thing. So it's why I feel like I get it, I see it, and I'm like, oh, that's me. It doesn't really work. Especially for a book this size. And I found myself sort of wishing that she had just dropped us in Alaska. We can get there and learn things about the past through conversation and dialogue without having to like experience all this exposition up front that clearly Kristen Hanna didn't even want to do. She was really bored. She just wanted to get to Alaska. There's a romance in this book between Lenny and Matthew, who she meets when she's young and then like continues to kind of like have feelings for as she gets older. And it's like 95% trite garbage. Like it's just Romeo and Juliet. And like we all read that in middle school and I don't need to reread it again. This book was really just like, it was really, there was a lot to love and there was a lot to hate. And I found myself at the end feeling like even then, like the end went on a little bit too long. This book could have been 200 pages. Just write what you want to write and forget all this other stuff. I am ranking on it. There's parts of it that are so beautiful and like I don't want to discount it completely because I didn't hate it. I gave it 3 stars. But like it unfortunately left kind of a bad taste in my mouth because so much of it was what I didn't want. Even though there was a lot that I did. It's a mixed bag. The next book I'm going to talk about is On the Come Up by Angie Thomas. If the cover and name sound familiar, this is the same author of The Hate You Give, which obviously was a huge deal last year. I had an interesting relationship with The Hate You Give because I feel like I read it after everybody else. Everybody loved it so much. Like everyone gave it like these raving, like, oh, 5 stars. It's the greatest, YA book out there. And then I read it and I was just sort of like, yeah, it's good. It's good. It's great. Like it didn't change my life. Specifically, I think I mentioned with Becky Albertalli, it's the same problem. Like the pop culture references are just like rampant and it really takes me out of the story, which is my own problem, but that was just my takeaway. And I still really loved The Hate You Give, but it wasn't like, it had been built up a little bit too much for me. The premise sounded really interesting to me, and I was really excited to dive in, and I absolutely loved it. Maybe it's because it hadn't been built up for me at all. I liked it a lot better than The Hate You Give. Maybe that's just me and like the story. So it's about a girl named Brianna. It actually takes place in the same like area, neighborhood as The Hate You Give. So this story, they make references to events that happened in The Hate You Give. So same neighborhood as Star, different experiences obviously, but like living in the same world. She wants to be a rapper. Her father was a rapper, and he died, and she like is battling with this, like continuing his legacy, but also stepping out like and being her own person. She's got her mom and her brother and her friends. Her aunt And so it's a great cast of characters. I just loved reading it. The story is just great. I really didn't know where it was going next, and that's always really exciting. So Brianna's like pursuing her rap career in the ways that she can and dealing with the way that she's being stereotyped at school, because she goes to a school for the arts, and so there's a lot of like racial dynamics there. I felt like it did a really good job of like dealing with the issues of today without it just being about that. Like, it still really felt like it was about one person and her specific story and life, but the things that she deals with felt very real and true. I just think Angie Thomas is great. I think the stories that she tells are incredible, and I'm like really emotional about her and Becky Albertalli and Adam Silvera, like being this sort of golden trio of like YA writing. There's actually, Angie Thomas thanks Becky Albertalli and Adam Silvera in the acknowledgments of this book, which made me like, and then there's like a sneaky little Simon versus the Homo sapiens agenda reference in On the Come Up that like obviously made me kind of like emotional. I think it's the same things that I said about Leah on the Offbeat a while ago. That's like, I just love that these books are being written. I love that teenagers get to read them. I love that I get to read them. If I have any quibbles with specifics about the writing or anything about them, like, I just want them to keep writing and for people like them to write and just to like bring these stories to the forefront, because that's so important to me, especially in YA. I just like am so thrilled that these people are writing these books. The next book I'm going to talk about is called Census by Jessie Ball. This was a very interesting read. It is about a man who has a son who has Down syndrome. It sort of takes place in a world like our world, but also not like our world, which is very unclear. They like the book mentions that Germany exists. So it's not like they're on another planet or a different reality, but the country that they're in is very unspecified. This man, it learns that he is dying. And so he becomes a census taker, and he decides to take this one last kind of trip with his son, where they're going to go from towns A to Z and do the census. And that's going to be kind of their final farewell. And he basically predicts that he's going to die by Z. And then he's going to put his son on a train and send him back to A, which is where there are going to be people there who'll take care of him. The census is very vague. They're sort of just counting all of the people in the land, wherever they are. And when the census taker counts them, he has to tattoo them on their ribs, on their stomach, to show that they've been counted. So kind of vaguely dystopian. Like, it's not really dystopian because censuses obviously happen, but the aspects of it that are like the people who are both pleased to be counted and the people who are like, get out of my house and don't ever come back. Like, there's an interesting kind of like vibe to this, that there are people who resent the census and there are people who accept it. The style is very different. It's very specific. And when I first started it, I was like, this is either going to work really well for me or it's going to work terribly. And then it sort of was actually kind of in between, because there's a lot of like beautiful lines that stand on their own, like lines that end a chapter with this sort of like punch or like a button. But then the style of it is just very, I don't know how to describe it. It's a choice. And sometimes it worked for me and sometimes it didn't. What did work was extremely beautiful. There's a lot to dig into about being observed, like noticed, counted, and known, because not only is obviously that part of the census taker's wife, who has died years previous, was a actor, performance artist, clown, and she would do a lot of these very strange routines. There's actually a very funny act that she does at one point where she invites like a couple dozen people, that was all that was allowed, a couple dozen people to come into this theater. They watch her on a stage doing nothing with a trumpet next to her for like hours. And there's just a certain part where everyone's like, is this it? And they all kind of get up and leave. And then at some point in the next month, she would show up at their houses in the middle of the night and blow the trumpet really loudly. And then she would hand them a letter, and the letter would say, I have to read this because I don't remember it. It is your life. Your presence is required. You can't say where a thing will happen. So that's the sort of thing I'm talking about, like really evocative language and thoughts. And it's all sort of about being known and being present. So I found that very interesting. I wouldn't say that I loved this book. Like I said, there was parts of it that really didn't work for me, but I was very fascinated by it. I sort of felt like I should be studying it rather than reading it. So I gave it 3 stars. It's another one of those books that's like, if this style works for you, you'll absolutely love it. And there's a lot to love about it, even if the style doesn't work for you. Like, it's an interesting story. I actually read the author's note in the beginning, and Jesse Ball's brother has Down syndrome, or had Down syndrome. He died recently. And so this book, a lot of the purpose of it is to be like, this is a story about someone who has Down syndrome, because Jesse Ball has felt like it's not represented the way that his brother was, like in the media and stuff. So that he wants to write about that experience, like from a really real place. So I also love that aspect of it. That felt very true and familiar. So yeah, it's interesting. The last book I'm going to talk about is There's Someone Inside Your House by Stephanie Perkins. I love this book so much. I wish I could read books like this all the time. As you can tell from the title, it's scary. I think I've alluded to it slightly before, but I am a huge horror fan. I love to be frightened. I love to be scared. I actually, little mini shout out, my partner and I have a horror movie podcast called Now Screaming. So if you like horror movies, you can go check that out. We talk about all the horror movies streaming on Netflix. So I love horror, and I don't really read that many horror books, at least not that would be like kind of classified that way. I would like to read more, and so this is my attempt to do that. And it's terrifying. It's about a girl named Makkai, and she has transferred schools from Hawaii to Nebraska. So culture shock, obviously. She has this thing that happened in her past, and she can't talk about it. And then while she's sort of dealing with being this like new kid at school, there's a boy she has a crush on, all these different kind of things. Someone is also killing people from her school. Your very kind of classic horror movie setup. It actually reminded me a ton of Scream, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. This is hitting those same beats. Down to like the first chapter is not about Makkai, it's about a different girl, and you're like, oh, here's our main character, and then it's not. Ooh. Not only is it like really frightening and has a great plot and was just really cinematic and like gripping, like I was getting legitimately so scared while I was reading this. It's also wonderfully diverse. Like, Makkai is Hawaiian. I think actually she's half Hawaiian, half African American. Her best friend named Darby is trans. And so that felt just so good and exciting to be able to read a horror book, but to also have this great representation. I was just so into it. I literally read it in, I think, one day, and I was just so unbelievably in from like moment one. I did a thing I shouldn't have done, which is that I went and read the reviews of this on Goodreads, kind of thinking that it was going to be kind of like common consensus that this was a great book. And apparently people don't like it, which I think is bananas. And I'm forced to assume that it's just because people don't actually like horror. Like, someone said something like, this book introduces so many minor characters just to kill them. And it's like, yeah, that's the slasher genre. That's what it is. So if you like horror, if you want to be scared, I would recommend this book very highly. Stephanie Perkins apparently mostly just writes romance. I didn't know that. I've never read anything else of hers, and I don't really read romance, so I probably won't, but I hope she writes more horror books, because this had romance in it, but it was very much like a horror novel. I don't know, it really, I bought in completely. I gave this 5 stars. I really went back and forth between 4 and 5, because like, it's not a perfect book, and it's not like, I've talked a lot about 5-star books kind of being like, they change you somehow. They've got something very like ephemeral that we can't even put our fingers on. And that wasn't this. I feel like I just had to give it 5 stars because it was just like specifically what I want and love. It was a personal 5 stars, not necessarily a like objective literary criticism 5 stars, if that makes sense. So that's all for this time. Next time we're going to talk about a very interesting assortment of books. I'm hoping to get through quite a bit more in March because I've got a very specific goal that I want to hit, and there's so much coming out this year that I just want to get to, and I feel like every time I start a book I'm like, we got to get to the next one because there's just so much to read. So please like, comment if you had any thoughts about what I said in this video. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And I look forward to talking about more books that I'm gonna get to in March. And until next time, believe in yourself.